This is the time of year that Christians celebrate the incarnation of Christ. But is the incarnation just something unrepeatable in history that we look back on, or is it something that we're meant to model as Christians and as missionaries? We'll explore this exciting topic in today's Christmas edition of the Missions Podcast. But first, let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel fled his home in Peru when he was 12 years old after his drunken father threatened to kill him. Daniel became an alcoholic like his father. One day, he ended up at a local church. But as a Roman Catholic from his upbringing, Daniel resisted the evangelical gospel that he heard and vowed to disprove Christianity itself. Well, that didn't last long. Daniel was converted, and he developed a passion to share the gospel with the lost. That's when ABWE missionary Steve Douglas noticed and began discipling him for 9 years. Today, Daniel has founded a seminary in his city of Arequipa, and he's planted 15 churches of his own. Daniel's special, but he's not unique. We're finding partners like these all over the world. And in this changing global climate, we can continue to do greater things for the Great Commission by partnering with people on the field, already risking all to make disciples. Your gift to the Global Gospel Fund can impact 1,000 missionaries working in more than 70 nations. Become a partner now. Go to abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund 20. That's abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund 20. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Advancement for ABWE, joined by Scott Dunford out on the West Coast, lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Actually, I believe that at the time we put this episode out, Christmas will be in the rearview mirror, but until then, right now, I don't know if you can hear the popping of the wick in the background there, but I've got my little candle here. Let's see what kind of candle this is. It's burning. It's filling my recording room here with some fragrance. We have a gingerbread garden light handmade grass-fed tallow local beeswax candle, bringing in the holiday cheer. I don't know
if that tallow wasn't grass-fed, I think we'd have a problem. But since the tallow came from grass-fed beef, I think it's probably an amazing candle.
It's beef wax. Actually, I think it's grass-fed beef wax.
Well, the tallow comes from the beef and the wax comes from the bees. Wow.
I mean, the worst thing is when you have gingerbread that is made with, inorganically fed tallow. Gosh, that's just the worst. Yeah. We're ringing in the holiday season, Scott, and I don't know. I used to be of the opinion that I used to be somebody who Thanksgiving was his favorite holiday. And I've changed over the last few years. Christmas is awesome. People complain about the consumerism, even in the missions world. There's a lot of griping about the consumerism of Christmas. And fine, maybe that's all well earned, right? I think we're all annoyed by the efforts to secularize and monetize Christmas. But I am all about the excess in a godly way, but like the feasting, the celebrating. Like if there's ever a time that we should not be afraid to go over the top in expressing joy and worship and exuberance, it's over the incarnation of God in human flesh, right? But the question that we kind of set this up at the beginning with, Scott, has to do with the incarnation. Here's a word. You tell me if you've heard this, okay?
I'm ready.
Kind of a buzzword, incarnational.
The word for the day would be kind of incarnational.
The word of the day is incarnational. And I'm pretty sure if you were to type that in a Microsoft Word, you'd get red squiggly lines underneath of it. It's one of those kind of like gospel-centered or I don't know, pick your Christian buzzword, right? It only has meaning within our contexts. But it's this word used to describe the way that ministry should be done. And there's a growing movement to look at the incarnation of Christ, not just as this unique, unrepeatable act of God becoming flesh, but also as something that's kind of a blueprint for Christians. And I think there's a lot to talk about there. But you're preaching through several passages relating to Christmas right now at your church. I'm curious for you, how are you treating the topic of the incarnation, knowing that, and this is something we've talked about on the show even lately, knowing that the average evangelical in the pew doesn't necessarily have a strong idea of what the incarnation is and what the two natures of Christ are and the hypostatic union and all these things about our theology of our theology proper, about the nature of God, about our Christology, who Christ is. How do you talk about the incarnation this time of year and instill some of those foundational truths first and foremost?
That's a great question. It is something that comes up a lot in the mission world. We hear that a lot about this is the nature of incarnational ministry. And I think when people say that, I'm glad you brought up the hypostatic union, and I'm glad you brought up the dual natures of Christ, because there is a sense, I don't want to say a sense that I got to be careful with my words when you're talking about theology, right? But Christ is fully God. And in the sense that he's fully God, the incarnation can't be repeated by us, right? The sense of God putting on human flesh and dwelling among us is not a repeatable event by missionaries. That happened one time, and it's only going to happen one time, where that is a unique event in redemptive history. And to talk about that could bring up ideas of like, does the missionary, is he godlike in that sense? And there's nothing similar at all to an American moving to Papua New Guinea and learning Pidgin and living in a tribal setting like that. That isn't incarnational in that sense, because there's such a huge gulf between what God did in coming in the human flesh and what I'm doing, and maybe in learning a new language. They're not even similar, but
right.
There is that sense in that the Christ is also fully human, right? And so maybe incarnational it would be is a tricky word to use for this, but there is a sense in which like it's interesting we've been preaching through this Advent series where we're kind of focusing on the places of the incarnation and the places of Advent, and looking at these locations that are part of the Christmas story. So the first sermon was on Egypt, and where he's, and especially focusing on that passage, out of Egypt have I called my son, which is a really interesting passage. The idea of like Nazareth and bringing out, why is this family of the line of David living in like a city, a tiny little village on a hill that isn't ever even mentioned in the Old Testament, and how could Jesus fulfill that passage? He should be called a Nazarene, because that phrase never occurs in the Old Testament. It's
How do you answer that?
What's
you
that?
throw that out. How do you answer that as you're preaching through that?
Well, this isn't part of this topic, but what I understood it, what I understood it to mean is understanding like that Nazareth has connection to the Hebrew word for branch, and that most likely, and this is what at least some scholars think, is that after the exile, followers, the descendants of David, who kept the promises that God was going to raise up a root from the tribe of Jesse, kept in believing that God was actually going to keep that promise and raise up a king, even after the exile and after they were sent away and after they were brought back. And then when they established the little village of Nazareth, they had that mentality of, we are the branch and we believe the promises of God are true. And yet, Nazareth was treated with, kind of disdain, as we kind of saw from Nathaniel's, like, this, could anything good come out of Nazareth? It's kind of a place of, that whole area was a place of like turmoil and unrest. And at one point, something like 2,000 Jews were crucified because of a revolt during Jesus's lifetime as a young boy. And so, Nazareth wasn't considered like a place that good things happened out of, but those descendants of David believe the promises of God. So that's a little off topic, but also not, in the sense that I think there is a sense in which Jesus isn't just God incarnate, but is also fulfilling the promises that were made to Israel, and fulfilling, and in some ways he's a personification. He is the fulfillment of these promises that were made. When it says, out of Egypt have I called my son, talking about Israel, and it's fulfilled in the person of Jesus. And so there is a sense in which Jesus functions not just as God come in the flesh, but also as the perfect human, restoring humanity, and the perfect Israel, restoring the promises of Israel. And I realize, not everyone's going to listen to this and agree with with my theological take on this, but there is a sense, even what we talked about with the fill the earth a few episodes ago, where yes, where Jesus is restoring that original mandate that the glory of God would be seen throughout the earth through Jesus, and then his body, the church, the people of God. And so I think in that sense, we can say that our ministry is incarnational, in the sense that we are modeling Jesus. We're living out what Jesus has called us to do, because in First Corinthians it talks about us being, Second Corinthians, it talks about us being ambassadors for Christ. And so I think we take that mentality and we understand that we are ambassadors for Christ, spreading the fragrance of God and of his good news. So yeah, I'm curious, Alex, what do you take? How do you respond to what I just said? And do you have any takes that you would disagree with, or anything you want to build off that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you said. And I think one of the challenges is that we as evangelicals tend to take for granted our doctrine of God and our Christology as well. We tend to focus much more on issues like justification by faith, right? And where do I go when I die? And how can I get to heaven when I die? And within our own evangelical subculture anyway, we don't always feel as though there are a lot of people trying to fight us on the Trinity, or trying to fight us on the nature of Christ. And so we get used to not having to defend Christian orthodoxy on those fronts. And yet those are fronts on which we do have to be ready to fight and be prepared to give an answer. So I do get a little nervous when people throw around words like incarnational that sound, really smart and intelligent. Like you have to have, 3 letters after your name to understand it. And, wow, oh yeah, incarnational. I just get a little nervous when we use that instead of saying what we mean, which is something that I think we can get into a little bit later. What does that really mean? And so I think at the very least, we need to be on the foundation of understanding who Christ is. So hang on with me. I just want to read for a minute or two from the Chalcedonian Creed, the definition adopted by the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. So this is in response to controversies that were happening at the time between the East and the West. And this is what they said. This is an English translation. I'm going to skip through a few parts. They say that our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in Godhead and also perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, of a reasonable or rational soul and body, consubstantial. So that means he shares the same substance or same essence with the Father according to the Godhead, and consubstantial with us. So shares the same essence and nature with humanity according to the manhood, in all things like unto us, without sin, begotten before all ages of the Father, according to the Godhead, and in these latter days for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, according to the manhood, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in 2 natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably, the distinction of natures by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person and one subsistence, not parted or divided into 2 persons, but one and the same Son, the only begotten, God the Word, the Lord Jesus Christ. And it goes on from there. But the bottom line is there's a human nature, and it's a real human nature. It's the same human nature that we have. There's the divine nature, which is the same divine nature possessed by the Father, by the Holy Spirit. Christ is one person, but possesses these 2 natures. We're not going to conflate those 2. We're not going to mix them. He's not 50-50. He's not any of these things. And the problem that happens with discussions of the Trinity, so shifting from Christ alone to talking about the Trinity, the problem that happens with the Trinity is anytime you try to apply an analogy to it, you immediately end up in heresy, right?
Right.
The Trinity is kind of like the 3 forms of water. Well, no, that's Sabellianism or modalism, just for an example. The same thing happens to us, I think, with Christ when we don't understand that the incarnation was an unrepeatable act.
Mm.
It was incredibly, it was in its very essence and nature unique, unrepeatable, right? There's nothing that you can compare it to. The eternal God taking on a human nature, not losing his deity, but at the same time taking on a real human nature, capable of hunger, capable of thirst, capable of dying, as we see in the Gospels. And I think that needs to be our foundation. It's useless to talk about being incarnational in our ministry until we've understood who Christ is, and we should just dwell upon that, the audacity of God to condescend down to our level. But going from there, then, because that's true, because the Son of God condescended into human flesh and suffered, died, rose again on the third day, rules the universe, offers salvation to anyone who repents and believes in him. Because of that, I do want to talk about what it actually means to then go and try and be incarnational. So I do want to revisit that topic. Does that sound good, Scott?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, we'll do that right after this quick break. Cross Conference 2020 is coming. This December, gather a group of 18 to 25-year-olds in your living room or church auditorium and join the Cross 20 live stream. Your group will hear from David Platt, Trip Lee, John Piper, and others as they aim to emphasize the clarity of the gospel, the centrality of the local church, and God's heart for the nations. Registration is just $10 per person. You can learn more and register at cross20.com. Learn more again and register at cross20.com.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention.
And this June, attend the national conference. Go to abuseprevention.org and register with ABWE21 as the promo code to receive 20% off your ticket. That's promo code ABWE21 to receive 20% off. Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades-long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
We're back with our Christmas episode of the Missions Podcast, and just taking a whiff here of my gingerbread, what is this? Grass-fed tallow local beeswax candle. These things burn hotter, by the way. The beeswax candles do generate more heat, so...
And speaking of buzzwords, I mean, that candle's got all the buzzwords in it. It would work for a great evangelical agency as well. Good example for us. How do we fit in these buzzwords like incarnational?
That's right. Local grass-fed tallow, local wax, beeswax, buzzword, incarnational ministry. Well, Scott, on that note,
yeah.
Okay, somebody says we should do ministry in a way that's local fed. No,
right.
In a way that's incarnational. Okay. And let's just say that phrase is thrown out there. How do you interpret that? What do you see that as meaning when people will throw that around in our circles?
Yeah, and I think that when people say that, they're actually onto something really important and good. In that, there is the sense, and I think that even the fact that the Bible spends times talking about the places of ministry, and Christ was shaped and formed, and his personhood, his human personhood was developed in ways that you and I often are, right? Like the places where you are a product of having lived in Philly and the suburbs of Philly and York. I'm a product of having grown up in Wisconsin and then lived in Michigan and Asia and all these those form us, right? And those are the places where the ministry that we leave behind are in those places, right? Like, the young man that you share the gospel with, is in a place. He spoke a certain language, and I think that's what people mean when they say, I forget the Max Lucado, the Max Lucado phrase, but he's got all these little like pithy phrases like, can you imagine, Jesus eating your soup? Well, it brings the humanity of Jesus to us in the way of like, whoa, yeah, like Jesus, played whatever games little Jewish boys played in the town of Nazareth, and he probably stubbed his toe on the tree stump that for generations little boys had stubbed their toes on, and he was part of that, And so when we say, he took on flesh and he dwelt among us and we beheld him, I think that there is something that missionaries should learn from that, in the sense of we need to be present in the places where we are, and that we represent Christ. We don't put on godness and come and God dwells with people, but we do represent God, and we do represent Jesus, and we do represent the gospel in real places. Jesus spoke Aramaic and probably Hebrew and Greek. And he spoke the language there, and it was very natural to him. And we need to be careful that we don't get into what sometimes has happened in Christian history, where there's like this, there's probably a really formal word, but kind of this, neo-Gnosticism where like we're on a spiritual plane and we're just, trying to pull people up into that and not dealing with the nitty-gritty of life. And I think that's what missionaries are talking about when they say incarnational ministry. And we do need to make sure that we're doing that. We need to be in the places where we live and know those places and know the people of those places, and minister in that way. What is that what you're thinking too?
I agree. I think there's two things going on here. The first is this Gnostic notion, and the word Gnostic gets thrown around in a very non-technical way. What I mean by Gnostic is this tendency to think the physical, the material is bad, is inherently fallen and corrupt, and the spiritual is the only thing that's good, and it's ethereal, it's wispy, it's less real, it's less.
I heard, to interrupt you for a second, I heard a very prominent evangelical pastor. If I said his name, most of our listeners would have heard him, have his books on their shelves, and cheer him on. Say something to the effect of, "We know that this life doesn't really matter." And you're like, "What? Wait a second." That is so like anti-Christian in the way it views this life. This life really is important and really does matter. The physical stuff does matter. Yeah.
And we live in an era where I think we're incentivized to think Gnostically about these things. I'm actually halfway through with my wife watching the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which goes into all your friends and neighbors, Scott, the people in Silicon Valley. But the issues there of how these algorithms are driving our lives and plunging us into this world that's virtual, and it's a really fascinating documentary. I haven't watched it all the way through yet, so I can't technically recommend it, but it's certainly worth watching so far from what I've seen. The point being, with technology, with everything that we have around us, it's very easy to not live life in a way that's embodied. And the Christian faith comes in and says, no, the material universe is good. The physical material aspects of Christmas are good. Yes, it's about the birth of Christ. You can also enjoy eggnog and partying with your family at your house and fireplaces and whatever other beeswax candles you choose to enjoy at Christmas time. The material is good. It's redeemed by Christ. So I totally agree. I think that the way that we do ministry, yes, it's about proclaiming the gospel, but it's a gospel that touches on all of life. We're not trying to just wisp people off into heaven. And so to be incarnational, it means to care for the poor. means to care for the hurting and the dying. It means to care for what's happening in society. It means to engage in visitation and to care for the least of these. I mean, these are things that I think we tend to overlook because we're so afraid of the social gospel. I think it's easy to forget that, Paul in his gospel preaching, that the disciples in Jerusalem said to him, like, well, as long as you tend to the poor. And he says, which thing I was eager to do in Galatians. And so I think that we need to be embodied and we need to be present in our physical locations and really present wherever we are, right? That Jim Elliot quote, wherever you are, be all there. The other thing that I think is going on, in addition to the Gnostic element, though, if I could just kind of zoom out for a second, I think we need to do more than just be incarnational. And if I could pick a better word for incarnational, I wish we could just talk about Christian ministry or maybe just ministry with humility. Because what incarnational tends to do is, I cannot, I'm already incarnate. I am infleshed. I'll actually always be infleshed. The idea that I'm not infleshed and I have to go and inflesh myself to contextualize, to minister to people around me is not accurate. I am infleshed already. I think what we're talking about is just what Paul describes in Philippians 2 of having this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. He goes on from there. He's exalted at the right hand of the Father. And he says, therefore, and he describes how you should work out your salvation with fear and trembling. In other words, Christian service, humility, ministry, unity, the things that he talks about in Philippians 2 are applications of this principle of humbling. It's not incarnating. We can't do that so much as it's humbling. We can imitate the incarnation insofar as we humble ourselves. But I think it goes beyond that. The incarnation, what makes it amazing, and I'd love for you to push back on this if you want to. I don't know. But a good book that I would recommend on this, if you're somebody that's into reading old classics and if you're into church history, Saint Athanasius wrote on the incarnation, and in that book, which you could read in one sitting. And really the English translation is very easy to understand. Honestly, it's less esoteric than a lot of the theological scholarship nowadays. And one of the things that he says is really likely to be misunderstood. Athanasius says, "For the Son of God became man so that we might become God." Now that sounds like straight out of the serpent's lips of Eden, right? Like that sounds completely wrong. He's not saying that we become God in the sense that we replace him or even that we become deities or anything. This isn't Mormonism, right? You don't get your own planet, those sorts of things. But he's describing what Peter in the New Testament calls it partaking in the divine nature, that we get to share in relationship with God, that we get to share in his attributes of holiness, of love and purity that he imparts to us through the Holy Spirit, that we get caught up into the life of God. So that what makes the incarnation such a big deal is not just that God came low, but that he also ascends back into heaven and he invites us to partake of God with him and to join the family of the Trinity and to be related to God as a son, a lowercase s son, not an uppercase s son like he is. But he became enfleshed so that we could be right with God, sitting with him, on his throne in some of these almost blasphemous sounding ways that Ephesians talks about it. But, reigning with Christ. I mean, what is that? It sounds blasphemous and we can barely wrap our minds around it. And yet the heights of the glory that he raises us to, are just as astounding as how far low he came in the incarnation. What are your thoughts on that?
Man, I think that's really important for us to understand, and that we are flesh. We are carnate. We are physical, spiritual beings from the very creation. It's not that our flesh wasn't because of the fall. Our flesh preceded the fall. But Jesus God is spirit, and the Son took on flesh to become part of us, to redeem us. So I think that's important for us to understand. That our flesh isn't bad in and of itself. I mean, the human side, the physical side of us, but our fleshly nature, our fallen nature, is obviously something different. And so when we do ministry, we are doing ministry as real people, and we are doing ministry to real people with spirits, but also with flesh. But we're following the example of Christ, who humbled himself, like you just said, took on flesh and dwelt among us. And so we can model our ministry after Jesus, because he gave us that example and set that example for us. So as we go into this Christmas season, I hope that our listeners are going to be able to tell great stories. And we say Christmas is over. I think in my mind, Christmas begins December 25th and lasts for 12 days. So we're just beginning the celebration and the ways of serving and living out that gospel message. And I hope that our missionaries will have great examples of not just declaring the spiritual side of Christmas, but the physical reality of how we bring salvation to bear in this fallen world.
Amen. And we need to do ministry in a way that's humble, modeling the incarnation, but we also can't do that unless we're thankful first, right? Unless we worship and reflect on what Christ has done. So have a Merry Christmas, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Missions Podcast. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. Also, email me, alex@missionspodcast.com, with your questions, your thoughts. Make sure you smash the subscribe button. Make sure that you like and share this episode to get it in front of more people. And until next year, thank you for listening.
Have you ever been approached by a student expressing a missionary call? For the last 15 years, Spurgeon College's Fusion program has been equipping students for missions through life-on-life discipleship, college coursework, and intensely practical training. If you know a student desiring to become a missionary, send them to Fusion at Spurgeon College as their next step. To learn more about how we are equipping students for a lifetime, visit spurgeoncollege.com/fusion.